If you are alone right now, I want you to pause for a second and listen carefully to the quiet around you. Because in 1995, above the Arctic Circle, we discovered that silence is not the absence of danger. It is sometimes the sign that something is already close enough to kill. We were 8 men stationed in a temporary Arctic operations camp, conducting a winter endurance trial, fully armed, fully monitored, and fully convinced that nothing could approach us without being heard. At 2:31 in the morning on our 17th night, every sound outside our shelter stopped at once, not faded, not weakened, but erased, as if the world had been muted by force. Our wind sensors showed movement, our thermal cameras showed distortion, but our microphones recorded nothing. That was the first time we realized we were being hunted by something that did not need sound to move. They later called it the Skugvarg. Witnesses swore it killed in total silence. Before I tell you how we survived what should have killed us, comment the word silence below and tell me where you are watching from, because this is the only documented case in 1995 where the prey did not run. My name is Henrik Lund, and I was there the night we decided to hunt the thing that was hunting us. When people imagine fear in the Arctic, they imagine wind screaming across ice fields, metal structures rattling against frozen bolts, and the constant reminder that nature is louder and stronger than any human presence foolish enough to challenge it. But what unsettled me that night was not the violence of the environment. It was the unnatural precision with which it stopped. I remember standing inside the operations shelter staring at the audio waveform on the monitor, watching a perfectly flat line extend across the screen where there should have been atmospheric disturbance, low-frequency wind roll, distant ice fracture signatures, or at the very least the faint mechanical resonance of our own equipment vibrating through the snowpack. And instead I saw a line so clean and so mathematically still that my first thought was not that something was outside, but that our system had failed. I recalibrated the external array manually, adjusting gain thresholds and reinitializing the parabolic mics mounted along the perimeter poles. But every channel returned the same result, which was absolute acoustic null, a reading so sterile that it felt manufactured rather than natural. And as I ran diagnostics, my breath began to feel too loud in my own head, as though the silence outside had started amplifying everything inside me. Behind me, I heard boots shift across the insulated flooring as Lars and Petrov leaned over my shoulder, both of them seasoned enough in Arctic deployment to understand that silence itself is not rare in extreme cold. Yet both of them instinctively knew that this was different. Because even in the deepest winter, there is always movement, and movement always creates friction, and friction always produces sound. When the first perimeter motion alarm triggered, it did so without a corresponding audio spike, which should have been impossible, because the sensors were calibrated to detect displacement through vibration, and vibration by definition produces detectable energy across at least one of our monitored channels. Petrov moved to the thermal monitor and zoomed in on the flagged zone, and what we saw was not a body, not a heat signature, not the outline of an animal crossing our field, but a distortion in the snow's thermal uniformity, a cold mass cutting forward through the landscape as though the air itself were being displaced around something that did not register as living tissue. It advanced in a straight line toward our camp, maintaining consistent velocity without slipping, without stumbling, without pausing to reorient. And as it moved closer, I realized that the distortion did not produce any visible compression in the snow beneath it, which meant whatever was approaching us was either impossibly light or not interacting with the surface in a way we understood. Lars stepped outside with a rifle despite my warning, because instinct overrides protocol when something unknown begins closing distance on you in the Arctic night. And through the reinforced viewing slit, I watched him scan the darkness under the floodlights while the thermal distortion continued advancing, yet his body language told me he could not see what our instruments were detecting. Then, without any sound, without a crack of ice or displacement of powder, Lars staggered backward as though something had struck him in the chest, and his rifle discharged into empty darkness while his boots carved trenches into the snow as he fought to regain balance against a force we could not see and could not hear. That was the moment I understood that whatever was outside was not simply present, it was choosing when to exist. When we pulled Lars back inside the shelter, he was not bleeding, he was not clawed, he was not torn apart in the way you would expect from a predator attack, but the center of his insulated parka was crushed inward, as though a massive weight had impacted him at full force. And as we cut away the outer layer, we found bruising forming in a pattern that did not resemble teeth or claws, but something broader, almost like the imprint of a forearm. He kept insisting that he never saw it, and what unsettled me most was not the fear in his voice, but the confusion, because he described the sensation not as being struck by something solid, but as colliding with pressure, as though the air itself had hardened and driven into him with deliberate intent. While Petrov secured the door and initiated lockdown protocol, I returned to the monitors and rewound the thermal feed frame by frame, and as I slowed the footage to 1/4 speed, I began to notice something that had not been visible in real time, which was that the cold distortion was not amorphous as we first believed but structured, with subtle angular shifts that suggested jointed movement rather than drifting mass. The distortion rose slightly in height as it approached the floodlight perimeter, and for less than a second the snow reflected a contour against the light that resembled a shoulder line and elongated upper limbs, not in the hunched quadruped posture of a wolf, but in something disturbingly upright. I felt my stomach tighten as I enhanced the contrast, because the distortion did not radiate heat, it absorbed it, bending the thermal field around itself in a way that suggested density far beyond that of normal biological tissue. We cycled the floodlights to maximum output and activated the external drone camera, sending it upward to gain aerial perspective. And as the drone ascended above the camp perimeter, its onboard microphone transmitted nothing but our own internal static. Yet the visual feed showed the same cold absence, circling our shelter in a slow, deliberate arc. It was not charging. It was studying. When the drone's spotlight swept across the distortion, the beam did not reflect off fur or skin, but seemed to flatten against a surface that did not properly exist in the visible spectrum. And for a fraction of a second, I saw the outline of a head turn upward toward the drone's lens, revealing 2 darker voids where eyes should have reflected light. The drone feed cut out immediately afterward, not with signal loss, but with complete data wipe, as though the recording buffer had been cleared rather than interrupted. Inside the shelter, the silence pressed against us harder than the cold ever had, and I realized that the Skugvarg, as the locals would later call it, was not merely silent by nature, but actively suppressing acoustic output within a defined radius, which meant that our greatest survival advantage, early detection through sound, had been neutralized. Yet in that realization came something else. If it could suppress sound, then it had to be manipulating vibration. And if it was manipulating vibration, then it was interacting with physics in a measurable way, which meant it could be disrupted. For the first time since the distortion appeared on our screens, fear began to give way to calculation, and as I looked at the seismic sensors embedded beneath the ice, I understood that silence was not its invisibility. Silence was its camouflage, and camouflage can be broken. By the time the second hour of enforced quiet pressed its weight against our shelter walls, the men stopped speaking in short bursts and started communicating in long, deliberate sentences whispered close to one another's faces, not because we were afraid it could hear us, but because we were afraid of what we would hear if sound returned all at once, like a door slamming shut inside the skull after you have been holding it open with your hands. Petrov laid out the facts with the cold steadiness that made him useful in any crisis, and he did it while checking every latch and seam as if the Skugvarg could leak through an imperfect seal, because he believed it was not simply a predator, but a phenomenon with intent, which meant we could not afford to treat it like an animal that obeyed hunger alone. We had one advantage, which was that our camp was built on instrumentation, and instrumentation does not care about myth or fear. It only cares about measurable disturbance. So I began pulling up the seismic sensors embedded in the surrounding ice and the ground-penetrating radar we used to monitor crevasse risk, because if the Skugvarg was manipulating vibration to erase sound, then it would have to generate a counter-signature somewhere in the system, and that counter-signature would be the one thing it could not hide from. The first pass through the seismic readouts made my scalp prickle, because there were micro-tremors occurring in a consistent rhythm that did not align with wind or ice pressure, and the pattern traveled in a curve around the camp perimeter like footsteps that never touched the surface, which meant the creature was moving with mass and intent while insulating itself from the audible range. Lars, pale and furious at his own helplessness, demanded we open fire into the darkness and end it with brute force. But I knew that firing blindly would only waste ammunition and reveal our desperation. And desperation is the scent that predators follow, even when they do not follow sound. I told them we were going to do something uglier and smarter, something that did not require us to hear it coming, because we were going to force it to make a choice between staying silent and staying intact. Our equipment crate held industrial vibration beacons used for ice survey, devices designed to send low-frequency pulses through frozen ground so that reflected waves could map density changes, and I realized with a sudden clarity that if we could flood the area with controlled vibration strong enough to disrupt its acoustic suppression, then the Skugvarg would either be forced to retreat or be forced to interact, and interaction meant visibility. We suited up in layered silence, moving with exaggerated care as if we were handling explosives. And when Petrov cracked the exterior hatch, a thin blade of Arctic air slid inside with such stillness that it felt like entering a sealed room rather than stepping into open wilderness. And I remember thinking that the absence outside was not natural, it was curated. We placed 3 vibration beacons in a wide arc beyond the floodlights, spacing them like the corners of a net, and I kept my eyes on the snow rather than the trees, because the Skugvarg did not need branches to hide behind. It could hide in the gap between sensory expectation and reality. When the last beacon was planted, I initiated the pulse sequence from inside the shelter, and the ice responded immediately with a deep, almost imperceptible thrum that you could feel through the soles of your boots rather than through the ears. And for the first time since 0231, I saw something on the audio monitor that was not a flat line. It was tiny at first, a trembling spike like the first heartbeat after resuscitation, but it proved that sound could exist again, and the men stared at the screen as if it were a miracle. Then the spikes grew sharper, and the seismic feed began to show frantic displacement between the beacons, a sudden furious pattern that indicated speed, anger, and an attempt to cross the arc without triggering a measurable interaction. And I understood that the Skugvarg had been forced to move fast, which meant it had been forced to care. We had baited something that did not want to be noticed, and now it was trying to correct that mistake. The first audible sound that returned to the Arctic that night was not the wind, not the creak of ice, and not the distant groan of shifting snowpack, but a low, wet pressure that made the back of my teeth ache, as if the air itself had been squeezed through something narrow and hostile and released in a single controlled exhale. Every man in the shelter froze at once, because fear is a language the body speaks faster than thought. And for the first time, we knew we were not imagining anything, because the microphones had captured it, and the waveform on the monitor rose like a jagged black wound across the screen. Lars lifted his rifle with both hands, even though his arms were shaking from adrenaline and bruising, and Petrov stepped closer to the viewing slit with a flare ready, because light is the only thing humans still worship when they do not know what else to do. Outside, the vibration pulses continued to roll through the ice, and with each pulse the thermal distortion flickered, breaking its smooth camouflage like a shadow caught in a strobe, and in those flickers we began to see it, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to understand the scale of the mistake we had made by assuming we were dealing with something that belonged in our categories. It stood higher than a man, but it did not stand like a man, because its posture was wrong. too long in the torso and too deliberate in the shoulders. And the arms, if they were arms, hung with an unnatural patience, as though they were built for reaching rather than running. The head shape shifted each time the vibration pulse hit, as if its outline could not decide whether it was a wolf, a bear, or something that had learned the geometry of predators and was wearing it like clothing. And when the floodlights struck the edge of its form, the snow around it did not glitter. It dulled, as if light lost its courage close to that body. It moved closer in short advances, each step timed between the vibration pulses. And that timing terrified me more than any size or shape, because it meant the creature was not only hunting us, it was learning our trap in real time, adjusting its movement to avoid full disruption, the way a smart enemy adjusts to gunfire by counting the seconds between reloads. Petrov threw the flare through the hatch opening, and the bright magnesium bloom lit up the perimeter in a violent white glare. And for the first time, the Skugvarg cast a shadow, not behind it but toward us, a heavy dark wedge that crawled across the snow like a living stain. In that flare light, I saw details that made my throat tighten, because the surface of its body was not fur, not skin, but a layered texture like matted frost and burned fabric fused together. And the face, when it turned, did not reflect light with eyes the way animals do. It absorbed it with two pits that looked less like pupils and more like holes punched through reality. Lars fired, and the rifle shot cracked like thunder in the newly returned soundscape, and the bullet struck the edge of the distortion with a visible ripple. Not blood, not impact, but a wave traveling across a membrane. And the Skugvarg reacted with something that was not pain but irritation, as if we had touched it rather than heard it. It surged forward then, and the microphone screamed with feedback as the sound around it collapsed again. And for a split second, I felt the shelter walls vibrate as if the creature had reached out and squeezed the air itself. And I realized the silence was not a passive effect, it was an active grip. Yet the beacons kept pulsing, and each pulse broke that grip for a heartbeat. And in those broken heartbeats we had our chance, because the Skugvarg could not remain both invisible and unstoppable under sustained vibration. We had finally forced it into the same world as us. And now, if we were going to win, we had to keep it there. The moment I realized that the Skugvarg was timing its movement between our vibration pulses was the moment fear began transforming into something colder and far more dangerous, because predators rely on superiority, and superiority collapses the instant the prey begins to understand the pattern. I adjusted the beacon frequency manually, increasing the pulse rate in irregular intervals, rather than the predictable rhythm we had started with. And as the ice began to hum in fractured sequences instead of clean waves, the thermal distortion outside faltered, its calculated advances breaking into sharp, almost desperate corrections that suggested it could not recalibrate fast enough to the new sequence. Petrov saw it at the same time I did, because he let out a low breath that sounded more like relief than terror. And he said that if it needed silence to function at full strength, then chaos might be its weakness, which was a theory we could test immediately rather than speculate about in fear. Lars reloaded with hands that were finally steady, not because he was no longer afraid, but because fear had been replaced by direction, and direction is the only antidote to paralysis in an Arctic night that does not forgive hesitation. I triggered all three beacons into a synchronous burst mode, forcing the ground beneath the Skugvarg to vibrate unpredictably from multiple angles. And what happened next was the first true sign that it could be destabilized, because the distortion that had moved with such smooth, predatory confidence began to fracture at its edges like ice under thermal stress. The microphones exploded with overlapping sound signatures as the suppression field flickered, and in that chaotic storm of returned noise we heard something unmistakable for the first time, which was a strained, guttural resonance that did not resemble a roar or a howl but a mechanical tearing, as though something inside its structure was being forced into alignment against its will. The floodlights reflected more of its surface now, revealing that its limbs were longer than we first estimated and jointed in ways that suggested both quadrupedal speed and upright leverage. and when it attempted to retreat beyond the beacon arc, its movement faltered again as the vibration waves intersected beneath it, trapping it inside a perimeter defined not by walls but by physics. I felt a surge of understanding rush through me as I watched it struggle to maintain cohesion, because the Skugvarg was not merely suppressing sound, it was stabilizing itself through the absence of vibration, which meant we were not fighting a silent hunter in the traditional sense. We were fighting a being that required acoustic stillness the way a human requires oxygen. Petrov ordered the secondary generator online, routing additional power into the beacon grid so that the amplitude increased beyond survey specifications, and as the ice began to tremble with a low, relentless tremor, the distortion lost its clean outline and revealed glimpses of form between flickers, flashes of elongated forelimbs striking at the air, and a torso twisting as if trying to escape a net woven from invisible threads. Lars stepped forward with controlled aggression and fired again, and this time when the bullet struck there was more than a ripple, because a dark vapor burst outward from the point of impact, dissipating in the vibrating air like ash caught in crosswind. For the first time since 0231, I felt something that resembled certainty. The Skugvarg could be hurt, and if it could be hurt, it could be hunted. The Arctic night no longer felt like an endless white void but like a battlefield defined by invisible currents, and as the vibration grid intensified, the Skugvarg's movements shifted from calculated stalking to reactive aggression, which told me that we had stripped away its preferred environment and forced it into ours. It lunged toward the nearest beacon with sudden explosive speed, covering distance in a blur that bent the thermal image into jagged streaks, and when it struck the device, the metal casing dented inward as if crushed by hydraulic force, yet the asynchronous pulses continued from the remaining units, keeping the disruption field alive. Petrov did not hesitate as he grabbed a spare charge pack and sprinted into the snow to reposition the surviving beacons closer together, effectively tightening the vibration radius so that the Skugvarg would have less space to maneuver without destabilization, and I remember shouting warnings at him, even though I knew he understood the risk better than I did. The microphones were no longer flatlined but saturated, recording a chaotic blend of ice fracture, electrical hum, and that deep internal resonance emanating from the creature itself. And within that noise, I began to discern a pattern that sounded almost like strain, like tension building within a structure not designed to endure prolonged interference. Lars coordinated suppressive fire not blindly into darkness, but at moments when the distortion flickered into partial visibility, and each impact produced more of that dark vapor discharge, which now left faint residue across the snow that evaporated within seconds under the vibrating air. When Petrov reactivated the repositioned beacons, the pulses overlapped with such intensity that the ground beneath the Skugvarg visibly fractured in hairline cracks, radiating outward, and in that violent oscillation its form solidified more completely than at any point before, revealing a towering, frost-layered body with elongated limbs and a head angled too far forward, as if evolution had been interrupted mid-process. It tried once more to suppress the soundscape, and for a brief moment the microphones dipped toward silence, but the sustained vibration overwhelmed the suppression field before it could fully form, and instead of silence returning, a piercing, distorted howl tore through the Arctic air, a sound so raw and furious that it confirmed what we had suspected all along. It was not invincible, it was cornered. In that howl there was no mysticism, no supernatural detachment, but unmistakable rage, the sound of a predator realizing that its primary weapon had failed and that the prey in front of it was no longer retreating. I locked eyes with Lars through the shelter glass and saw in his expression the same conclusion forming, which was that we had one window of opportunity before it adapted again, and that window existed only as long as the vibration grid remained intact. For the first time that night, the balance had shifted. The Skugvarg was no longer hunting in total silence. It was fighting to survive the noise we had forced upon it, and we were not running. We were closing in. The moment the Skugvarg released that distorted howl into the Arctic air, I understood that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, because predators that rely on superiority rarely survive exposure, and exposure is exactly what we had forced upon it through sustained vibration and relentless acoustic disruption. The ice beneath the creature had begun to fracture in widening radial lines, not because of its weight alone, but because the overlapping pulse frequencies were amplifying structural stress in the permafrost. And I realized with sudden clarity that we were no longer just destabilizing the Skugvarg itself, we were destabilizing the environment it depended on to maintain cohesion. Petrov shouted through the roar of interference that we should push the amplitude beyond safe thresholds, even if it meant sacrificing the beacons entirely, because the data no longer mattered and the survival of the team had become the only metric worth preserving, and I did not hesitate before diverting full generator capacity into the grid. The vibration frequency climbed into a range we had never tested in field conditions, and the air itself seemed to shimmer as the ground resonated with a deep subsonic tremor that made the bones in my chest feel hollow. Yet instead of collapsing into silence again, the Skugvarg's form began to solidify under stress, as if the forced vibration was stripping away its ability to blur the boundary between presence and absence. Lars stepped outside without waiting for approval, planting himself between the remaining beacon arc and the creature's line of retreat, and although every instinct in my body screamed that this was reckless, I understood what he was doing, because he was denying it escape velocity and forcing it to remain inside the disruption field where its camouflage could not stabilize. The Skugvarg lunged with violent acceleration, but this time its movement was visible to the naked eye, rather than inferred through distortion, and as it crossed through the overlapping pulse zone, its limbs faltered mid-stride, jerking unnaturally, as though invisible currents were pulling against its joints from opposing directions. Petrov activated the emergency seismic charges we had brought for avalanche testing, small controlled blasts designed to fracture ice shelves, and he detonated them not beneath the creature, but in a tight triangular pattern around it, creating a focused resonance chamber that amplified the vibration grid into a localized shock wave. The explosion was not loud in the traditional sense, but the ground convulsed with such force that the Skugvarg's body flickered violently between states, alternating between distortion and solidity in rapid succession, and in that strobing instability, I saw something that confirmed we were close to breaking it completely. Its outline was fragmenting, not dissolving into darkness, but fracturing like brittle glass under sustained pressure. Lars fired again, not blindly, but precisely into the center mass as it solidified. And this time the impact tore through it with a violent rupture that expelled a dense cloud of dark vapor far thicker than before. And the vapor did not simply evaporate, it dispersed in chaotic eddies as if stripped of the structure that had once contained it. The Skugvarg tried once more to collapse the soundscape, and for a heartbeat the microphones dipped towards zero, but the sustained resonance overwhelmed the suppression field before it could fully form, and the silence shattered under the weight of engineered noise. For the first time since the 17th night began, the Arctic wind returned, and the Skugvarg staggered. When the natural wind cut back across the ice fields, it felt like oxygen flooding a suffocating room, and in that restored soundscape the Skugvarg's form no longer appeared as an untouchable distortion, but as a massive, frost-layered entity straining against forces it could not neutralize. Its limbs slammed into the ice in an attempt to regain balance, but each contact point triggered another surge of vibration through the fractured permafrost, creating feedback that rippled up its elongated frame and destabilized whatever internal mechanism allowed it to manipulate silence. Petrov reloaded the seismic detonator with the final charge, while I recalibrated the beacon frequencies one last time, narrowing the pulse intervals into a relentless barrage that denied the creature even a fraction of stillness in which to rebuild its suppression field. Lars advanced with measured steps, not reckless but resolute, and I could see in his posture that fear had been fully replaced by intent, because he understood what I understood, which was that if we allowed even a second of acoustic collapse, the Skugvarg might regain its advantage. The creature lunged again, this time directly toward Lars in what was either desperation or rage, and as it entered the tightest convergence point of our vibration grid, Petrov triggered the final charge. The ground beneath the Skugvarg detonated upward in a focused seismic surge that did not scatter ice outward, but drove energy vertically through its core. And in that violent upward thrust, the creature's body fractured completely, splitting along lines that had been forming since the amplitude exceeded its tolerance. What emerged was not blood and bone, but a catastrophic implosion of structure, as the dark vapor that defined its mass tore free from itself and dispersed into the vibrating air in shredded spirals that lost cohesion with every pulse. It tried to reform, pulling fragments inward as if attempting to reconstruct a stable outline, but without silence to anchor it, the vapor scattered uncontrollably, thinning into nothing under the sustained acoustic assault. Lars fired the final round directly into the collapsing center, and the impact triggered a burst of energy that reverberated across the ice field like a shockwave of breaking tension. And then, with no dramatic explosion and no lingering shadow, the Skugvarg disintegrated into particulate darkness that evaporated into the restored Arctic wind. The microphones registered only natural sound: wind across snow, ice settling, human breathing. For several seconds, none of us moved, because we were waiting for the silence to return, waiting for the flatline that had defined the terror of the night. But it did not come back. The vibration grid continued humming until I powered it down manually, and when the final pulse faded, the Arctic remained alive with ordinary, imperfect, comforting noise. We stood there under the floodlights not as survivors of a hunt, but as men who had reversed it. In 1995, above the Arctic Circle, witnesses swore the Skugvarg killed in total silence. But they do not tell you the second part. Silence was its weapon, and we took it away. When the final vibration pulse faded and the Arctic wind continued without interruption, none of us celebrated, because victory in an environment like that does not feel triumphant. It feels suspicious, as though the world is waiting for you to relax before correcting your assumption that you have survived. The floodlights illuminated a fractured ice field where the Skugvarg had stood, and although no body remained, the snow carried evidence of violent interaction, not footprints in the traditional sense, but deep stress patterns radiating outward from the detonation point, as though something of immense density had occupied that space and then been forcibly dismantled at a structural level. Petrov insisted on conducting a full perimeter sweep despite the exhaustion pulling at our limbs, because none of us were willing to assume that disintegration meant extinction. And as we moved across the broken surface with weapons raised and thermal scanners active, we found no distortion, no cold void, no acoustic collapse, only the ordinary imperfections of wind-cut drifts and ice cracks settling into equilibrium. What unsettled me most was not what we found, but what we did not find, because there was no residue, no biological trace, no measurable remnant that could be cataloged and studied, which meant the Skugvarg had either never been biological in the way we define life, or had existed at a threshold where matter and vibration overlap in ways we barely understand. Back inside the shelter, we replayed every recorded second from 0 to 31 onward, and the data confirmed what our bodies had already felt, which was that the acoustic suppression field had collapsed completely once sustained resonance exceeded its tolerance, and that collapse coincided precisely with the moment its form destabilized beyond recovery. Lars sat silently with an ice pack against his bruised chest, staring not at the monitors but at the doorway, as if expecting the silence to seep back through it, and I realized that even in victory we were not free of the instinct that something might still be studying us from beyond perception. At dawn, the sky shifted from black to pale iron gray, and as natural light replaced artificial flood glare, the Arctic looked indifferent again, vast and cold and utterly unaware that something extraordinary had been forced out of existence during the night. We transmitted a partial report to headquarters, omitting anything that sounded speculative or supernatural, because men in offices do not accept silence as a predator, and we knew that describing the Skugvarg as an entity that required acoustic stillness to maintain cohesion would invite skepticism rather than reinforcement. Yet among ourselves we did not debate what had happened. We had been hunted, we had adapted, and we had destroyed the thing that relied on our fear of the unknown. But even as we packed down the beacons and powered off the generators, I understood that what we defeated was not a myth pulled from folklore, but something that had existed in measurable reality and had expected us to remain passive. We did not, and that made all the difference. Years later, when people ask me why I still sleep with a white noise machine running beside my bed, I tell them it is because I grew accustomed to Arctic deployment conditions, which is not entirely untrue, but it is not the full answer either. The full answer is that I no longer trust perfect quiet. After 1995, I reviewed hundreds of hours of field data, looking for anomalies that might suggest we had misinterpreted a natural phenomenon as something extraordinary, but every analysis returned the same conclusion, which was that the acoustic suppression was deliberate, localized, and directly correlated to the presence of a moving mass that could not fully exist under sustained vibration. We published a sanitized report describing equipment malfunction caused by seismic instability, and the Arctic Endurance Program was quietly discontinued the following year. But none of the men who stood inside that shelter have ever dismissed what happened as environmental coincidence, because coincidence does not learn. Coincidence does not adapt between vibration intervals, and coincidence does not retreat when its advantage is removed. What we encountered above the Arctic Circle was something that had survived by weaponizing silence against creatures who rely on sound to detect threat, and for as long as it existed unchallenged, it had likely killed without resistance, leaving behind nothing but the absence of explanation. But that night, it miscalculated. It assumed we would freeze in fear when the world went quiet. Instead, we made noise. We forced it into our measurable spectrum, and when it could no longer hide inside silence, it shattered. If you are listening to this right now in a quiet room, I want you to understand something important, which is that fear becomes lethal only when you allow it to define the rules of engagement. The Skugvarg killed in total silence, until we refused to be silent back. If this story made you look differently at the quiet around you, comment the word noise below, and tell me where you are watching from, because every voice in that comment section is proof that silence does not own the night. And if you want more true horror cases where humans do not run, where the hunted become the hunters, subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes the only way to survive what stalks you is to make it hear you coming.